It's really great to be with you all, especially because I am a big fan of this group and friends with Gabe. And though I don't live in Toronto anymore, I used to and loved coming to some of these events. And so it's just great to see how strong things are still going since 2015. And I'm really excited to be part of the event today and happy to join from where I live in the Yukon. Excited to see too that Sean Boots will be presenting next week. So Yukon's kind of taking over this month. And I'm really excited to get your feedback today because this project is still pretty early on. We aren't live with any governments yet. And today's presentation is really about the tech that we're building and what it could do and how it could help government. And because you are experts kind of in various ways within government, we're hoping that this isn't just a one-way presentation, but the dialogue is the part I'm most excited about. I'm going to try and get through this presentation part quickly so we can do some fun Q&A. But Hyper is, looking at automating 311 phone calls with AI. We've explored a bunch of different things, but government seems to be a really interesting angle. So as was mentioned, my name is Ben Sanders. You can find my LinkedIn and learn more about me there. But the TLDR is that I am a four-time tech founder, been working in tech for the last decade. Two of those projects, including this one, have a very strong GovTech component. Going back to my first year of university, I've been interested in government for a long time, most of my adult life. I was a page in the House of Commons. I worked in government in the Yukon, where I helped build this old grocery store space that I'm in now, which is kind of like a Mars. It's a co-working space, a maker space. We just celebrated our 10-year anniversary. So I worked on projects like that in government. And I also ran for office too, unsuccessfully, but I ran to be the MP in the Yukon a number of years ago. And so again, the intersection of tech and government is something that I'm really passionate about. So passionate that, in fact, that my last startup, Proof, you can see more about it at proofgov.com, was a project exclusively building software for government. And we were trying to speed up the approvals process because anyone who knows in government, who's worked in government knows that it's hard to get anything done without 10 people signing off. This software is being used in governments like the Yukon government today, in every department with hundreds and thousands of people. But I took a break after Proof and became a dad, and I found myself last year on pat leave in Europe in one of these tiny rental cars at 2 a.m. calling back to the Yukon feeling like a bad dad because I hadn't secured a spot for my kid to start daycare. And the reason I was calling is because all of the daycares didn't have an online presence or an email. And so I had to call at 2 a.m. in the rental car because my kid was asleep in our Airbnb. It was the only way to get through it. I had to call 30 times, and it was a really frustrating experience. And that's where I started to think, hey, ChatGPT is doing some cool stuff. Could it be possible to automate that type of experience over the phone? If any of you remember that demo from Google in 2018, where they effectively booked a haircut with AI. And so, for the first time in history, you don't have to be Google to try and put together that technology to build a voice AI telephone experience. And that was really exciting. And so 6 or 7 months ago, I got the old team from Proof back together and we started exploring this idea of what would it take? And it turns out it's really hard and harder than we expected for a whole bunch of reasons. But early on, trying to get a really good voice for a human was tough. That is getting better and better. Latency is an ongoing problem. When we started, we were able to get everything stitched together, but it would take sometimes 8 or 9 seconds before you'd hear a response. And that just doesn't work. It kind of kills the whole uncanny valley concept of being able to present as a human on the other end of the line. So latency is a thing that we've overcome. We can get responses now in under about 800 milliseconds. Interruptions, if you think about it, it's a really hard thing too. We've been doing this our whole lives without thinking about it. Every day, we're kind of learning about when the other person's about to stop, when it's a good time to jump in, but getting computers to do that effectively in a way that doesn't kind of kill the magical experience is also really hard. And the list goes on and on. So hard, in fact, that we tried a whole bunch of different things in the last 6 months to think about who would be kind of the ideal first customer. We've talked to plumbers who are too busy wrenching that they need to answer the phone to not lose business. We've talked to banks. We've talked to all sorts of different people who might need this. And the thought occurred that it could be a really cool application for 311, in part because in 311, more than 50% of calls to your municipal government are actually just about getting some information, not opening a ticket, not doing anything, not dealing with personal sensitive information, PII, right? And so from a use case perspective, it's potentially actually a lot easier to build something for 311 before trying to do it for a bank or anything else that's a lot more complicated. Turns out that in North America, there are over 400 billion inquiries every year for 311. And 80% of those still go to the phone, even though cities like Toronto, have an app and have human chat, and other cities have automated chat, and there's web forms. There's all these kind of efforts to try and direct traffic away from the phone, but ultimately that's where still most of the volume goes. And the reason that's a challenge is because ultimately that's very expensive to serve. This is a headline that caught my eye because I'm from Winnipeg, and it was interesting to see that the traditional approach to, getting 311 wait times down is to just throw more money at it and throw more human bodies at it. But the challenge is you can't always time for when you need those calls to be available for kind of peak times and emergencies and whatnot. The other interesting thing out of Winnipeg is that just recently the mayor has said, hey, we want to hear some ideas for how AI could specifically help 311, right? So I'm often used to government not seeming like they're on the cutting edge, and here I'm seeing signals out there that might not be the case. Another reason why 311 could be an interesting starting point. When we think about Toronto, I don't know if any of you saw this in January, but it's actually costing us millions of dollars to staff up those call centers. If you submit a request for 311 on the app, it costs 10 cents. But if you call, the average call to 311 in the city of Toronto is between $11 and $16 per call. And because there's 1.2 million calls every year, that's millions of dollars that we could effectively displace or free up those people to do more important work instead of raising taxes, right? And I know all of you caught this news if you didn't catch the last one, right? The city hasn't been able to find ways to save money. I think that this could be a really interesting one. And so I was hoping to do a quick demo here, and maybe I'll pause for just a second to see if we've got it teed up. I know we were having a few hiccups. So maybe we'll come back to it because I think it's not ready to go just yet. I can also point you to our website, callhyper.com. And if you write this number down, I'd love for you to call it later once we get the thumbs up that it's back online. This is, again, the reality of being a startup and working through some services that are not entirely in our control. I think today's problem is linked to the LLM that we're using, a large language model from OpenAI is actually having some 429 outage right now. So let's try and circle back. But 311, it turns out, isn't the only opportunity where this could be helpful. So 911, though it might feel a lot more reasonable to consider starting with 311, and we would advocate that. 911 is also a really important opportunity where this technology could be helpful. The reason why is in Toronto, instead of 1.2 million calls per year to 311, there's 1.8 million calls per year to 911. And we don't have all the data, but the average call duration is typically longer. So that's tying up more agents. The interesting thing about this is 700,000 of those calls aren't really emergencies, even though people are calling 911. And so I was fascinated to uncover this recently, but there are cities in the US like Portland that are already using voice AI technology to triage some of those calls to ascertain if they are emergency or not, and then kind of direct them ultimately to a human agent to manage the call, but as a way to reduce the burden on 911. The reason that's important is because, believe it or not, this is another thing that really surprised me, but there are 911 calls that are regularly put on hold. Could you imagine, these are lives that are at risk where, because of staffing shortages and budget constraints, we aren't able to answer the call quickly. Now, in most cases, that's not a problem, but at times, this is a challenge. And that's another reason why Voice AI, even if it just came in to manage instead of waiting on hold, or to deal with kind of peak elasticity like you would on AWS, there's a use place for it where it's better than just waiting, right? In fact, some stats in 2021, there were wait times of up to 10 minutes in the worst case, right? So again, lives are at stake. It's not just taxpayer dollars, and this technology could really help save lives. Those aren't the only ones. So 988, if not sure if you're familiar with this is a federal hotline in the US and in Canada. Actually, Canada's just opened in November, and they're already getting 1,000 phone calls. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, was that per day? Let me just double check my notes. Yeah, it's 1,000 per day calls, and then 450 texts as well. So huge volume there. And the interesting thing about this, the suicide hotline, is I heard a Radio Lab just recently. You can go check it out. It's one of the latest that came out. And some interesting story there. So they interviewed a woman by the name of Stephanie Grosser, who's ex-US Digital Service. She was the tech lead for 988. And they get about, in the US, 3 million calls every year. But 13% of those calls, these are people who are thinking about harming themselves. They're calling a suicide hotline. And 13% of them, almost 500,000 callers, hang up because they're put on hold and they're just listening to hold music, right? This is, again, due to staff shortages, not being able to kind of answer every call quickly. And so they ran a whole process, including a 4-week real life test, and talked to 9 users, because there's a Paperwork Reduction Act from 1980 that prevents them from talking to more users, ironically. But they looked at all sorts of ways of making that better by changing the hold music, by changing the language that was used. They were only able to move the needle by 0.7%. So this is another huge opportunity where we should try and make a difference. 211s to a lesser extent, but there's all these hotlines that are being serviced by government. This one's for social services in Toronto, where they get 73,000 calls per year, right? So less emergency, still might be a useful opportunity to help. And beyond just kind of the call centers, in the US, for example, the IRS can only answer, it's the American equivalent of the CRA, the tax revenue agency. They're only answering 1 in 10 calls, right? So there's all sorts of opportunities within government to help in a big way. And so what if we were able to clone all of the expertise from the entire department, the knowledge base, scale them infinitely, just like AWS does, to hit those peak demands, and not to waste money to have people sitting there when the phone's not being called, because that's a problem too. And then what if we could respond instantly, 24/7? It's not every 311 outside of Toronto is able to support a 24-hour approach, and in any language. Today, I think Toronto supports maybe up to 180 languages, but that's because they bring translators in, and it's expensive and slower to deal with, right? So, the idea here again is moving more taxpayer dollars towards actually solving the problems rather than just talking about it. And if technology like Voice AI could help to ascertain, where the pothole is or where the graffiti is, and we could direct that money to actually fixing them faster rather than just kind of capturing that information slowly, wouldn't that be a better solution for everyone? I'm going to just quickly dial in and see if our demo is working, but it might not be, so just 1 second. Might not work, but we'll give it a try.
Hi, thanks for calling Toronto 311. My name is Sam. How can I help?
Hi, Sam. I'd like to report some graffiti.
Got it. Can you tell me where the graffiti is located?
It's right outside Sneaky D's at the corner of College and Bathurst.
Sorry, the line dropped for a second. Thanks for letting me know. Is there any other detail you'd like to include about the graffiti at that location?
I'm just wondering, how long will it take to get fixed?
I'll make sure to include that in the request. Can I have your contact info in case we need to reach out for more details?
Sure, yeah, you can use this number. It's 867-332-6666.
Thanks for providing your number. If you need anything else, feel free to give us a call. Have a great day.
Thanks, Sam. So that's a quick little demo. You know, for those of you in the breakout room, I'll invite you to call that number as well, and we can kind of get your experience and feedback from it too. But let's pause and do some Q&A.
John has a question.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the work of Joseph Weizenbaum?
No, John, can you fill me in?
Weizenbaum is the guy who actually wrote Eliza, which is the first chatbot on record. And he basically made the comment. He basically said he wrote a whole book on the ethics of artificial intelligence. And one of the things he said, which is very important, is we can never make computers wise. We can use them for recording information. We can use them for collecting data. We can use them for all kinds of things, but we can never make them wise. We can never make them humane. Therefore, we should never give them tasks which require wisdom. Answering a suicide prevention line, and I speak from experience here because I did it for 5 years. Answering a suicide prevention line requires wisdom. It requires humanity. It requires compassion. These are things we simply can't give computers. I don't care how brilliant, I don't care how much research is done. I don't care whether we create quantum computers. We will never, ever, ever be able to do it. If we do have a intelligent computer, a genuine case of lieutenant commander data, that intelligence will still be an alien intelligence. You notice Lieutenant Commander Data on Star Trek, the one job he never did have was ship's counselor, because computers just can't do that for human beings. I think that a lot of the work you do recording things like graffiti is definitely work that a computer can do. Answering a suicide prevention hotline, no way.
Hey, John, I really appreciate that feedback, and I'm a TNG fan, so the data reference makes a ton of sense. You can't step in for Deanna Troy. I think that's true, absolutely, today, you know, and I have friends who've worked in the mental health space with tech and have done some really cool things to kind of connect humans and make the experience better. So it sounds like we agree that it's a spectrum, right? And there are some use cases like 311 that are probably graffiti, potholes. You know, it's okay if things glitch out or don't work, you know, to start with there. And that's probably a better starting point. I agree 100%. Could this help eventually with some of the other harder challenges? Maybe, you know, but the tech would have to get better and maybe not. But if all it did today was to not put you on hold when you called the suicide hotline, and just even if it explained that it was an AI and told you that it was going to be 4 minutes because there was just a ton of people backed up, could that interactivity or that companionship potentially help keep you on the line just a little bit longer to ultimately talk to that human instead of hanging up, giving up because no one picked up the phone? It might be worth trying. I don't know.
John, I believe you're muted.
Your 988 research actually covered the question of how, like, in my experience, it's actually a relatively small minority of calls to distress centers that involve people that are actually intent on harming themselves. I don't know how the experience of 988 changes that. Whether the rule is basically just like you're not supposed to call 911 unless there's actually a fire or a police emergency. Maybe 988 is restricted in the same way. Distress centers, the vast majority of their calls are from people who are simply lonely and simply basically simply lonely or in distress for something else. I suppose with computers, you might actually make a case for triaging calls. I can understand computers might be able to ask a series of simple questions, which would maybe provide information about whether somebody was actually serious about harming themselves, or whether this is a situation where people just wanted to be heard and talk and could be either asked to wait or moved off to a different service. That's the only application that I can really see computers in any kind of coherent future being used for. Ultimately, computers, as Weizenbaum says, even if we really could make computers intelligent, it's an alien intelligence. It's not human. We cannot make them wise or genuinely sympathetic. And that really is what you need to have for somebody who is dealing with a person who is actually intent on committing suicide.
Thank
Yeah,
you,
John,
John.
Yeah,
That's
I really
really
appreciate
great
your input.
feedback.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, we're just like a little short on time, and I have another question online, if that's okay with the in-person folks.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm going to read Ben's question. He said, does it provide a way to escalate to a real person for cases where the AI fails to understand the question? Like your question about how long it would take to fix the graffiti.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ben. So today we don't have that in place, but it's just a function of us being a small team and kind of choosing the priorities of what to build. But it is very much possible, and something we're intending to build in. And one of the first cities that we're talking with about implementing this is actually kind of has that very much in mind. And escalating or triaging kind of proactively is the intent. So if the call comes in and it's handled, every call is handled by AI initially, and it sounds like a human voice that can ascertain, okay, this is one of the 2/3 of cases where you just need some information. I can look that up and give it to you. I'm going to keep going. But if it is more complicated or harder, or we know it's best served by one of the humans on the team, then we can actually kind of just say like, hey, great question. I'm just going to forward you to that specialist, right? And make that work. So that is the kind of gold-plated standard of doing it. But there is also the potential for, if the system's glitching out or not working or something, to kind of do it after the fact, or like in a broken scenario. We just think it would be even better to do it up front. There's also the scenario where we might not try to impersonate being a human and be upfront about the fact that, hey, you're on hold, for it's going to be 7 minutes to talk to a human. If you want, we have this cool new AI thing that'll help you instantly and give people that choice up front. That's another way to do it. Thanks for the question, Ben.
Thank you. Did you want me to read the last online question as well, Olivia?
Can we do some in-person questions?
Absolutely. Yeah. Sorry.
Oh.
Hi, Ben. Thank you very much for that presentation. Fantastic stuff. Quick question. In almost every machine learning, deep learning, AI type deployment, we always have a visibility problem. How are you trying to handle understanding how we got to those answers in those questions in the first place? That visibility problem is huge, and it's in every one of these deployments.
Yeah, I didn't catch your name.
Or I didn't catch that.
What's your name? Just curious to hear your name.
ZANO.
ZANO. Okay. Can you give me an example, just so the whole audience understands? Because I think I know what you mean, but
Yeah, I mean, every time an answer comes back, the people, let's say, monitoring the system needs to have some understanding of how that answer actually derived from the model itself. And this just happens in every type of these types of deployments.
Yeah, so in a lot of cases, it can be easier to build in a feedback loop when it's text-based or chat-based, because you can kind of ask for people feedback on like, hey, did my answer help or not? And like even a thumbs up or a thumbs down can help train the model to be like, oh, we got to find a better match in our vector database or something for that. The potential for doing that over the phone would be to audit the call transcripts after the fact. And in fact, there's a whole category of AI development right now, which is just trying to do that audit work in all sorts of places where AI isn't even being used. All sorts of businesses, governments, where maybe you have a team that takes a look today manually at 1,000 passport applications or immigration applications, right? And needs to check and see if everything was done right or not for an entirely manual process. AI can be a really good tool for doing more of that faster, and so there are some ways to apply those same methodologies to this, and again, the starting point is like tackle something that's easier, like 311 before 988, right? Where you can afford to make some mistakes and learn, but where ultimately the experience is still better than what it is today, which is waiting on hold or not being able to get through to someone. I hope that answers your question.
Hi, this is Jamie. Great presentation, thank you, and really exciting and really interesting stuff. My question is, I guess, about it's kind of connected to what Sanu was saying, but it's about trust from the person calling, and not necessarily trust about privacy or anything like that, more about like how can the level of trust they will have in the answers from a kind of AI like that. I feel like sometimes, when we use AI or chatbots, when we use chatbots, we have this kind of, we're trusting it about, I don't know, 70%, 80% of the time, because we know sometimes it makes mistakes or whatever. How do you kind of account for the fact that maybe some people won't have quite as much trust as they would in a person in something that is kind of AI based? And or is it not a problem? Maybe it's not a problem.
Yeah, I think Jamie was your name. Is that right? Thanks for the question. So trust is a really important one, especially in government, right? There's that line, moving at the speed of trust. This has informed a lot of our thinking over the last 6 months already. We started actually by building this as kind of a way to do sales for startups, in kind of a cloned voice. So our first prototype was something that actually sounded like me. You could call 100 people, kind of personalize something, and try and book a meeting with me to help do more user discovery. And what we learned is that trust element is really an important part of the whole experience, and it's something that I think anyone at 311 or any of these services is really going to want to think about. So we haven't got a perfect answer yet, but it's something that's at the forefront for sure. I would say that in my experience, humans, though there's a great number of humans out there working in government and all sorts of facets, sometimes there's so much information to know that like humans aren't perfect either. And so I would say that the starting point of an assumption of a human being more accurate or 100% accurate is something that I think we intuitively assume to be right when we call an expert, but isn't always true for the baseline. And the reality is that for a lot of things, I'm finding as I get older too, myself included, there are tools that I can leverage that are better than my actual memory of information or dates or whatnot. And so I think for a prototype stage, it might be important to have a bit of a disclaimer, right? But at a certain level of scale, when it comes to kind of accessing information about the bus schedules or anything like that quickly, this type of solution for that type of use case I think could actually be faster and more accurate than most humans. And I think there will be certain use cases where even if we know it's AI, we will prefer and feel that the results are better. If it's not there today, it will happen at some point. And that's true, especially for those kind of pieces of information that are purely retrieval, that don't have a lot of subjectivity, right? As the nature of the interaction becomes more nuanced, again, like the suicide hotline, right? I think there's still very much a role for humans to be involved in helping, guiding, and training that type of experience. So yeah, if I'd love to talk more about that in the breakout too. Thanks for bringing up the question.
We'll just take the last question from Shatu because we're running out of time, but everyone's welcome to stay for the breakout room discussion. Ayla, do you want to read out the question?
Yeah, for sure. Chachi says, curious about the process of training the AI. Following up with John, is there is a need for human presence and comfort. Do you think there is a way to meld, provide quicker service with AI and provide counseling with a person?
Yeah, I think I understood the question to be, could it be faster or better to connect them with a human? Maybe I missed part of it, cut out a little bit. Could you, Olivia, just rephrase it, or?
Sorry, there's two parts to the question. The first one, I'm curious generally about the process of training this AI. If you want, you can answer that one first. And then the second one is just the commentary following up with John, where I do agree that there's a need for human presence in something as delicate and as, I suppose, as delicate as this. And is there a way you think that we could blend that of the AI and then also provide the human experience of counseling with the person? So I guess there's two questions in one, and feel free to answer the first one first.
Yeah, great. I mean, the training one's a really interesting one because I don't think I mentioned it, but part of the reason there's these staff shortages for 911, I think the stats in Toronto is that at peak times they're understaffed by as much as 40%, which is why people are being put on hold. These are numbers that we cobbled together for Toronto. And part of this is because of the training time involved is significant, and a huge percentage of over half of accepted agents, I'll have to double check that this is true, but this came up in our research that over half of the people who want to get trained as humans to be a 911 call taker actually fail before they make it all the way through. So the cost to try and train humans is huge expense beyond just the $11 to $16 we talked about per call, and not many people are making it through, not to mention how many leave after probation. So training humans is hard, and we're not doing a good enough job at it for all sorts of reasons. In terms of training this system, the way that it works behind the scenes essentially is we have a telephony service that allows us to kind of connect to real phones, make and receive calls. We have a speech to text component that hears a human talking and needs to convert that to text with sentiment analysis and other things to kind of, give a guess on how accurately we interpreted that. Because with accents and dialects and poor connections, sometimes we don't get that 100% right. Right, and then we exchange that with an LLM and a large language model, like ChatGPT would be an example. So once it's in text, we can kind of get some conversational elements from them. But we use an external database, a vector database, that is essentially a collection of all of the kind of FAQ or knowledge base that government would have. And for 311, often that is already kind of a determined library of information. And essentially kind of the system can find in a big kind of 3D space, find the best kind of heat map connection for that question and that answer, and try to provide that result. So that's the initial training, is making sure you have the right knowledge base and one that is much more conversational. You can't just use the same one from a chat bot, because in a chat experience, the answer to one sentence question might be like a whole page of information, or like here are links ABC, right? Even the concept of of conveying a link to someone over the phone is different and harder than chat, right? So texting is an option to overcome that. But from a training perspective, getting that corpus of data right off the bat is the first and hardest part. And then the next part can be kind of auditing those calls and using a separate AI to do that, to say like, hey, this person struggled at minute 2 here. What was the question they asked? What was the answer? Oh, this looks like we didn't get it right. Is it because we didn't hear them properly? Is it because we didn't have the right information in the knowledge base? And that's ultimately something we can work with the governments to learn and train on, to get better from that data. Ultimately, the more you can put this call data through a system, the better you can kind of train it to be as well. So that's the training question. On the second part around kind of a blended approach, I think that makes a ton of sense. And it'll make sense for 311 to start, where it's maybe an easier use case than the 988 we talked about. But there might be a role forever to have humans and AI working together. You know, there's all this talk in the news about AI replacing jobs. And though we are proposing that there could be tremendous savings here and improved service by including AI as part of the offering, we're already putting technology forward to try and do that with 311, with web forms and apps and texting and chatbots, right? So this is just an evolution of the same thing, but it's not totally replacing every human. The idea is that this would make those humans better equipped to kind of do more calls or do the harder calls, so on and so forth. And a friend of mine, just a last anecdote, built a company called Inkblot Therapy, which was acquired by Greenshield Insurance. And we started in Toronto at Techstars at the same time. And I was trying to build proof with my team. We explicitly wanted to help governments. We built this kind of back-end efficiency tool that, you know, no citizens ever saw. So it never really, you know, the idea of spending more on efficiency never got a lot of as much traction as something like 311, which is a front and center issue for counselors, and, you know, because it's directly interfacing with the public. He went in with his team and built a marketplace to connect mental health specialists with patients, you know, and so it was humans talking to humans, but they helped connect the right people. And what's pretty cool today is that he had ultimately a bigger impact on government than Proof did, because now provincial governments are acquiring that service and making it free for doctors to kind of refer to it for patients. So that is a technology solution that's still using humans ultimately to make the calls. And it's had a huge impact on GovTech, even though they weren't trying to be a GovTech company. I think ultimately, just the last point is that it's inevitable that we're going to see more technology in our lives, right? Government's often a late adopter to some of these things. And so we should be thinking about how to blend those things effectively earlier rather than later.